Juramentación como presidente.
Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, was inaugurated today for a 6-year
Pues
term.
a los llamados de Nicolas Maduro es el mandatario de este país.
President is now facing unprecedented pressure both at home and abroad.
El presidente Nicolás Maduro ha tenido que afrontar grandes retos.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the stories we're covering this week. Venezuela. President Maduro begins his second term, and the media landscape looks far different than when he began his first. The Sudanese government faces street protests and turns to an online clampdown that's straight out of the strongman's playbook. The Wall Street Journal, a hoax, and the perils of single-source journalism. Plus, hagiography and American presidents. Nothing so becomes their legacy as their passing. Earlier this month, Nicolas Maduro was sworn in for a second term as Venezuela's president. The election that got him there was widely condemned as rigged, and opposition voices were mostly absent from the airwaves. The case against Maduro and his treatment of the media is compelling. His critics say that since he first took office in 2013, almost 100 radio and television stations have been censored or shut down, as well as 33 newspapers. Another 50 journalists have been prosecuted. We've been following the media story in Venezuela for more than a decade now. When Maduro's predecessor and mentor, the late Hugo Chavez, came to power, he pledged to confront the right-wing media outlets that dominated political discourse at the time, to democratize the media and give voice to the country's poor. However, Venezuelans now suffer under chronic shortages, and not just of food and medicine, of information. The pendulum has swung the other way, and there are signs aplenty that Venezuela's Bolivarian revolution has lost its way. Our starting point this week is the capital, Caracas.
Bienvenidos a esta transmisión conjunta de radio y televisión, donde en este momento y bajo los aplausos de los asistentes está haciendo su entrada el presidente Nicolás Maduro Moros. Esta emotiva llegada del presidente Nicolás Maduro a la sede del Poder Judicial para su juramentación luego del avasallante triunfo electoral del pasado 20 de mayo.
Es más,
It's more propaganda than information.
se aprecian en la pantalla venezolana de televisión la movilización de la gente que ha decidido asistir a estos puntos para acompañar al jefe de Estado Nicolás Maduro.
It's evidence that they're adhering to the guidelines given by the Ministry of Communications, despite the doubts and the controversies that have arisen.
Es decir, es la transmisión de un mensaje único.
They broadcast the official line that tries to justify the existence of a parallel reality to the one that Venezuelans are living on a daily basis. The contents are sweetened in order to avoid contradicting official reports. That's the reality of journalism in Venezuela. The government exercises extreme control, especially in broadcast media.
Especialmente en los medios audiovisuales.
Four voices on the state of the news media in a country that's as polarized as any on the planet. The government official from the Human Rights Commission, the academic, a specialist on political discourse in Venezuela, and two journalists plying their trade online, partly due to a shortage of paper. The election held last May was considered a sham by the UN, the EU, and the Organization of American States, and recognized as legitimate by, among others, China, Russia, and Cuba. The two main opposition figures were both disqualified from running. Voter turnout was the lowest ever. The millions fleeing the country are now part of the biggest refugee surge in Latin American history, chased by chronic shortages and inflation, the details of which they cannot count on their government and the media it mostly controls to provide.
The primary source of information is the Venezuelan government, but it doesn't actually inform. There are no details about inflation or what the GDP is.
Milagro. Espero que cuando estemos conmemorando los 2 años tengamos 6 millones de hogares abastecidos integralmente cada 15 días. Y a decir guerra económica, vete pa'l carrizo.
We've ignored those essential statistics for years. When the state stops informing and instead produces propaganda, then uncertainty rules and rumor becomes king.
Venezuela está siendo sometida.
Venezuela has been subjected to unilateral sanctions, illegal measures which are not shown by the media.
They only show the consequences of those sanctions, the crisis that's come as a result. It's a biased account. It's demonized the country's image, which in turn justifies any subsequent action.
Venezuela's government does have powerful adversaries, starting with a superpower to the north that takes a disproportionate interest in oil-rich countries. 2 days after the inauguration, the Trump administration said it was looking at all the options on how we influence the outcome in Venezuela.
This corrupt regime destroyed a thriving nation by imposing a failed ideology.
Washington has imposed 3 sets of economic sanctions on Caracas, and they've had an effect. They also provide the Maduro government with a convenient "they're out to get us" narrative to fall back on.
La Casa Blanca se prepara para violentar la democracia venezolana.
The economic crisis and the resulting shortages don't just affect consumers, they affect the news industry. Last month, El Nacional, a newspaper founded in 1943, published its final edition. One of the reasons given was a shortage of newsprint.
El Nacional is one of the most important newspapers in Venezuela. When it was launched, it represented a very innovative moment in journalism. It opposed Hugo Chávez's government and then Nicolas Maduro's, and as a consequence, it suffered retaliation.
El Nacional had been losing its original essence for a while. It was once one of the most influential newspapers in Venezuela, with a print run of 200,000 copies, and by the end, it had decreased dramatically to 5,000 to 6,000 copies, made up of very few pages.
Venezuela has a serious problem when it comes to getting certain supplies, like paper, which is not made here and which we cannot afford to import. So of course the media are going to suffer. Media are still in circulation, but they've moved online. That's just a global reality. So it's unfair to suggest that media outlets are being closed down. They're still there, but they're on the internet.
This journalism isn't widespread. Venezuela has the worst internet in Latin America. It's very difficult for people to use their phones in public, like in the US and Europe, and there is too much crime. Also, websites suffer constant attacks. We suspect that it's people from the government.
There's a context, a history to the story of the Venezuelan media. When Hugo Chávez was elected in 1999, the first leftist president in 40 years, the vast majority of news outlets tilted to the right. They were openly hostile to Chávez's Bolivarian revolution. In 2002, Chávez was briefly deposed in a coup, one that the media didn't just cover, they were participants, recognized for their efforts by coup leaders.
Gracias, Venevisión.
Who said they could not have overthrown the democratically elected Chávez without the help of right-wing media outlets like Venevisión, RCTV, and Globovisión. The changes to the media landscape that then began under Chávez have accelerated under Nicolas Maduro. Globovisión is just one example. Having backed the coup in 2002 under one set of owners, it is now in the hands of Raúl Gorín, a pro-Maduro businessman. Countless other media outlets, including major newspapers like El Universal and Últimas Noticias, have gone the same way. What began as a government-enforced market correction, a defensible response to a media sector that was out of control, has since grown into a crackdown.
When Chávez was in office, he enjoyed popular support most of the time, so repression wasn't so necessary. By the time Maduro came to power, sympathy for the government fell significantly due to the economic situation, the social situation, and so repression against the media increased.
Perhaps that's the difference with the past. Chávez was much more patient, despite the fact that the media tried to destroy him and his family. Under Maduro, there have been times when those who run the media have been held to account. Why? Because freedom of expression doesn't mean impunity. It's not just me who says it, it's enshrined in international treaties as well as our own constitution.
Nosotros somos los que decimos la verdad.
We are the ones telling the truth, that's what the government says. But for the system to work, we need media outlets that have no relationship to the government, so they can tell us what's really happening. A good government needs to be able to take criticism from its citizens. Their problem is that the reality is very obvious, and there is no way to hide it any longer.
We're looking at other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Tariq Nafa. Tariq, security services in Sudan have been trying to limit coverage of protests that began there last month. This past week, close to 30 journalists were rounded up, all from the same newspaper. Why were they targeted?
The journalists were working for an outlet called Jazeera, which has refused to comply with government censorship. The newspaper and others have received almost nightly visits from the security services, who harass editors and dictate what they're allowed to publish. Jazeera has refused to toe the line, and it's clearly paying the price. The Sunday issue of the paper was banned from publication for the third time in a row, and more than 10 of its editions have been seized since protests began in mid-December. When its journalists held a sit-in outside the headquarters of the National Intelligence and Security Service, 28 of them, including the editor Ashraf Abdelaziz, were arrested.
Okay, so that's the government trying to control the output of one newspaper. What about the online side, where censorship can be so much more difficult to enforce?
So the internet has been central to the organization of these protests. Arabic hashtags like Sudan's Cities Revolt have been used to mobilize people, then document and broadcast demonstrations to the world. President Bashir knows that, and he has ordered the internet providers to block access to platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp. It's all very Egypt 2011. The restrictions haven't really worked, though. Protesters have used virtual private networks, VPNs, to get around them, and videos like this one of security forces trying to mow down protesters have been shared extensively online.
Moving on. So last week, the Wall Street Journal reports that an American conservative activist has been banned from Twitter after complaints by some Muslim advocacy group. But the story turns out to be some kind of hoax?
Yes, an elaborate one. The activist is Laura Loomer, a far-right online personality who was suspended from Twitter for Islamophobic comments. A pair of internet pranksters came up with a plan to see how easy it would be to convince her that shadowy Muslim groups were responsible for getting her banned. So they posed as a disgruntled Twitter employee and convinced Loomer that Twitter's CEO, Jack Dorsey, had met with the Council on American Islamic Relations, known as CAIR, and that they had lobbied for her account to be taken down. It was a lie, but Loomer lapped it up. Apparently, the hoaxers wanted to see if she would take the story to an outlet like InfoWars so they could expose how the right-wing media food chain works. Instead, Loomer went to the Wall Street Journal, which published her account seemingly without any corroborating evidence or proper fact-checking. Bottom line, a prank designed to expose the far-right media bubble inadvertently revealed some very shoddy journalistic standards at one of the most widely read newspapers in the US.
Okay, thanks, Tariq. Turning now to hagiography, the definition of which is a biography that treats its subject with undue reverence. Journalists occasionally serve up obituaries that are reverential. The U.S. news media produced a few of them last year. First, for the former senator and prisoner of war, John McCain. Then, for George H.W. Bush, the country's president from 1989 to 93, who died in November. Bush's obituary suffered from a syndrome that critics call obit-omit, focusing on attributes and achievements, taking up column inches and television airtime, while controversial aspects of his record, among them alleged war crimes, were omitted. Such obituaries fail news consumers. See enough of them, and you'll find that they reveal more about the journalist producing them and the news outlet involved than they do about the deceased. The Listening Post's Daniel Turi now on the whitewashing of history in real time.
When Americans watch the news, they have a variety of channels to choose from, across the political spectrum. But in the wake of a political death, it can be hard to spot the difference.
He was truly one of a kind.
On the 30th of November 2018, George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States, died.
President Bush faced victory and defeat, tragedy and triumph with modesty, humor, and uncommon grace.
What a mind, what a heart, what a nice gentleman.
The wall-to-wall coverage was dominated by tributes that ranged from the admiring to the sentimental.
The former president remembered for his sense of decency, his kindness, and his commitment to others.
The coverage of George Bush Sr. In his death really emphasized personal qualities at the expense of policy.
Big question a lot of folks have been asking, what's next for Sully?
And even his dog, who, got more coverage than any dog since Lassie.
As we watched the pictures, we wondered aloud, is Sully just as sad as the humans who are missing this man so very much?
NBC did this, remarkable report by Jenna Bush Hager to a grandfather.
It's my turn to write a love letter to my Gamby.
I mean, one could take it as a sort of nice family tribute, but then why are they employing a journalist to cover her own family?
What do you want your legacy to be?
It has an effect of sort of depoliticizing Bush and making him, this kind of generic, lovable grandfather. You don't really get a sense of, this man was president. He made decisions that literally were life and death for hundreds of thousands of people.
I saw very little coverage of what he did politically. They were constantly talking about him being personable, having class.
Decency, honor, integrity.
Caring about his children, his grandchildren, and they have a place in talking about their loved one. But I think we have a responsibility in the media to go beyond that, to have an honest assessment of an absolutely critical period of U.S. history. We also have to remember the victims of his policies, the thousands of people who died in Panama, who died in Iraq, who didn't get a chance to write letters to their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren.
When you look at how the American media covered George H.W. Bush, they reflect a kind of outlook that seems to be under siege. That is, country first.
At 19, he became the youngest Navy bomber pilot in World War II.
All the memories of George Bush's reaching across party lines, the fact that he wasn't a hater, all that, I think, accounts for the fact that the coverage was overwhelmingly, if not totally, positive.
This morning, we remember his life and his tremendous legacy.
When the eulogies did address Bush's record, they offered a somewhat starry-eyed view of his time in the White House.
What a great man George H.W. Bush was, and how he guided America and the world through the ending of the Cold War, how he reunified Germany.
The President of the United
Other, more controversial aspects of Bush's legacy were given short shrift. His 2 years as director of the CIA were glossed over, as were the invasions he launched as commander-in-chief. Against Saddam Hussein's Iraq in 1991.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait.
And in Panama to overthrow Manuel Noriega, a dictator who had previously been on the CIA's payroll when the agency was led by Bush.
His history as the head of the CIA in cultivating dictatorships in South and Central America, and his history in the illegal war against Panama should very well have been part of the obituaries.
George Bush, que le pida a Dios y que le pida mucho perdón por todo el daño que le ocasionó a muchos familiares aquí.
The so-called Gulf War of 1990-91 was really a different kind of scandal. The United States bombed Iraq mercilessly, started a process of destroying that country. There was a so-called highway of death where the Americans just mercilessly killed Iraqi troops that were in full-scale retreat. They used depleted uranium in their bombs and produced generations of young children born with cancer. If you don't add that into the legacy of George H.W. Bush, I don't know who you're talking about.
I don't think it's surprising that the analysis of the Gulf War was muted. I think part of what explains the relative quietness was the contrast between the Iraq War as George H.W. Bush fought it in Kuwait and what happened with his son. What Bush did not do, the elder, was to pursue that war into Baghdad. There was a sense of restraint. The second thing is that the old Latin expression, "do not speak ill of the dead," applies just in general to the media.
The Latin saying, de mortuis nil nisi bonum, or of the dead, say nothing but good, has been part of death etiquette in the West for centuries. But does it make sense as a rule of thumb for journalists when they assess a political legacy? Honoring a leader in death often means forgetting those who died as a result of their policies. And as with all rules, it's one that American news outlets often break when it suits.
If you actually look at the media as a whole, this principle, we have to respect the dead, is very selectively applied. One can only look at sort of when Hugo Chavez died.
They've been living under this horrible dictator. I don't think he will be missed by anybody.
The American media was not like, well, we have to think of his family and what was he like as a grandfather.
Provocative and unpredictable strongman of Venezuela has died.
No, it was all about, well, this guy was a tyrant, he had human rights abuses. It was very blunt. And so there's definitely like a different standard for American leaders as against sort of foreign leaders, especially those outside the Western world.
The glowing eulogies to George H.W. Bush hinted at a nostalgia that went beyond patriotism, and even beyond Bush himself. The repetition of words like decency and bipartisan seemed to be as much about what, or rather who, he was not.
I will build a great wall.
President Trump's open misogyny, xenophobia, and lying have outraged mainstream journalists. And his attacks on news networks have turned the media into an enemy.
That's enough. Put down the mic.
With Trump serving as a constant point of comparison, redemption in the media has never been easier to come by for former American statesmen,
George W. Bush,
whether they're dead or alive.
I'm so excited to have you here. Are you as excited as I am to be here?
Yeah, kinda.
Yeah.
The reason why George W. Bush looks better to a lot of the press is simply a matter of contrast.
President Bush, it's always nice to have you here in the studio. Thanks for joining us.
In the case of Donald Trump, you have somebody who simply has no concept of what truth or falsehood is, who violates norms, who's a bully, who's a lout.
I'd like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you.
And so George W. Bush looks better by comparison.
You cannot compare things like that. You have to look at them as well for what they've done. And that's exactly what the media doesn't do. I mean, here's a direct war criminal, the man who has destroyed Iraq, based on an entire house built of lies.
Saddam Hussein is a threat to America. He's a man who said he wouldn't have weapons of mass destruction, yet he has them.
When he eventually dies, they're going to say, he was a decent man, he loved his children, he was a bipartisan. If they bring the illegal war in, it calls into question the American religion, that the American government acts benevolently around the world.
The media very much parrots the views of those in power. Sadly, journalists are a part of the establishment so much in the United States. It's hard right after a person dies to do an honest, real evaluation of their record, to speak ill of the dead. But journalism is the first draft of history. And it's at those moments that people come to understand their own country and our role in the world. And that's why the records of these presidents must be dissected, analyzed honestly. The key is not to erase what they've done.
One last point on hagiography and the politicians who don't even have to die before undergoing their mainstream media makeover. George W. Bush really is the poster boy for that phenomenon. A president whose catastrophic decision to go to war in Iraq ended up killing, and these are conservative estimates, hundreds of thousands. When he left office in 2008, he looked like he was beyond rehabilitation. But ever since the Donald Trump circus came to Washington, Bush has been benefiting from some favorable comparisons and getting more and more of the kind of fawning coverage usually reserved for dead presidents. We'll leave you now with a few examples of that, and we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
Our first guest tonight was President of the United States of America for 8 years, which is probably enough resume-wise, but he is also a painter with a new book of stories and art called Portraits of Courage. Please welcome the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush. I want to ask you. This is a question that I think is very important to me and very important to the country. When you were in office, and I don't know when this happened or if it happened, did you go through the secret files, the UFO documents? Because if I was president, that'd be the first thing I did.
Good morning to all of you. Great to have you here.
Good morning. I wish everybody could see how all of you interact when the cameras aren't on, because these are true friendships that are among all of you, which made your job, I would think, all the harder. Here you are, they're portraitist. You have to capture the essence of them. First, I have to say, did he get the portraits right? Did he capture you guys? I said so. Chris, you said he made you better looking. Oh, yeah.
People don't know this, but my daughter Jenna and you are good buddies.
Yes, we are.
And so my attitude is, if you're a good buddy of Jenna, you're a good buddy of mine.
She's a lovely girl. Your whole family. Your whole family. Yeah, she was on the show, and we called you, and you answered the phone. You actually picked up and talked to us while she was on the
Yeah,
show.
and I was actually the president.
Yeah, I know.